If you ever see hundreds of riders coming over the horizon toward a lonely ranch, you might think it is the beginning of trouble, but sometimes it is the end of a promise made long ago. Nathan Cole stood alone on the wooden porch of his old ranch house as the morning wind rolled across the dry Arizona prairie, carrying a wall of dust rising in the distance nearly half a mile away. And at first he thought it was only another dry windstorm sweeping across the grasslands the way they often did this time of year. But then he saw the shapes moving inside the dust, dark figures growing larger every minute. Horses, many horses, far more than a small group of travelers would ever need. And as the sun climbed higher, the shapes became clearer until there was no doubt left in his mind that riders were coming straight toward his land. Not 5 or 10 riders, but dozens. And behind them, even more shadows moving through the dust until it looked like an entire wave of riders rolling across the prairie toward the forgotten ranch that most people in the county barely remembered anymore. Nathan leaned his hand against the railing and watched them carefully, his weathered face calm but thoughtful, because a man who had lived on the frontier for 30 years learned long ago that when that many riders appeared together, it usually meant something important was about to happen. And down the road toward the small town, a few neighbors had already stepped outside their stores to stare at the horizon as well, some shading their eyes from the sun, some whispering to each other as the riders came closer, and the dust cloud widened behind them like a storm chasing the herd, and soon the truth became impossible to ignore because the riders were not random travelers at all, but Apache horsemen moving with quiet discipline across the open land. Their horses steady, their formation long and organized, stretching farther across the prairie than Nathan had ever seen before. Someone in town rang the old bell outside the general store as if warning people to pay attention, and more townsfolk gathered near the road watching the approaching riders with uneasy curiosity. But Nathan did not move from the porch, not even when the first line of riders came close enough for him to see the details of their saddles and clothing. Because something about the way they rode felt different from the kind of tension that usually followed large groups of armed men across the frontier. And as the riders slowed near the wooden gate at the edge of his pasture, the man at the front lifted one hand, and the entire line gradually stopped behind him, horses breathing in the warm air, dust drifting slowly past their legs, until the prairie grew quiet again except for the wind moving through the tall grass. Nathan stepped down from the porch and walked toward the gate, boots crunching on the dry earth. And when the leader finally dismounted and turned toward him, Nathan noticed something unexpected in the rider's eyes. Not anger, not threat, but recognition, the kind that comes from a memory buried deep in the past. And when the rider spoke, the words were calm and clear across the quiet ranch yard. Do you remember a little Apache girl who was lost in a blizzard many winters ago? And in that moment, Nathan Cole realized that the riders had not come because of the ranch or the land or the town. They had come because of something that had happened on a freezing night many years before, something most people had forgotten, but someone out there had remembered for a very long time. The rider's question hung in the warm air above the ranch yard. And for a moment, Nathan Cole did not answer because the words had opened a door in his memory that he had not walked through for many years, a door that led back to a night so cold that even the desert seemed frozen solid under the winter sky. And as he stood there looking at the rider, he felt the past slowly rising again like dust lifted by a distant wind. It had been nearly 20 winters earlier when that storm came across the Arizona territory without warning. A rare blizzard that rolled down from the mountains and swallowed the prairie before sunset, and Nathan had been riding back from town that afternoon with a sack of feed tied behind his saddle when the first snow began to fall, light at first, drifting across the grass like white dust. But within an hour the wind had turned fierce and the temperature dropped so quickly that even the horses along the trail had begun to turn their heads away from the wind. Nathan remembered pulling his coat tighter around his shoulders and urging his horse toward the ranch. knowing that storms like that could trap a traveler miles from shelter if he was not careful. And that was when he saw something unusual in the snow ahead of him. A small shape moving slowly along the edge of the trail, as if it was trying to walk, but could barely keep standing. At first, Nathan thought it might be a calf separated from its herd, but as he rode closer, he realized it was a child. A small Apache girl wrapped in a thin blanket that was already heavy with snow, her steps slow and uneven as the wind pushed against her from the open prairie. The sight made him pull the reins without thinking, and for a moment he simply stared in surprise because the nearest Apache settlement was many miles away across rough country that no child should have been crossing alone in a storm like that. The girl lifted her head when she heard the horse approach, and Nathan saw that her face was pale from the cold, her dark hair stiff with snowflakes, and even through the blowing wind, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes as she tried to keep walking. Nathan dismounted quickly, boots sinking into the snow, and when he spoke, his voice came out calm even though the wind was roaring across the prairie, asking the girl if she could hear him and if she was able to ride, but she did not answer with words because she was too tired. She only looked at him with the kind of quiet fear that comes when someone realizes they might not make it home. Nathan knew then that leaving her there was not an option, because a storm like that did not forgive mistakes. So he lifted the girl carefully onto his horse, wrapped his heavy coat around her shoulders, and turned the animal toward the ranch even though the snow had already begun covering the trail behind them. The ride back had been slow and difficult with the wind pushing against them across the open land, but the ranch house light eventually appeared through the blowing snow like a small star in the darkness, and Nathan remembered guiding the horse into the barn before carrying the girl inside, where the fire was still burning in the stone fireplace, placing her near the warmth while he poured hot coffee into a tin cup and heated water for soup. And the girl had finally spoken after several minutes when the warmth returned to her voice, quietly telling him that her name was Ayana and that she had become separated from her family during the storm. Nathan had simply nodded and told her she was safe now, because sometimes the most important thing a person can hear on a freezing night is that someone has decided to help them. And as he stood at the ranch gate in the present day looking at the rider who had just asked about that night, Nathan realized that the story he thought had ended long ago might only now be beginning again. The memory of that winter night stayed clear in Nathan Cole's mind as the years slowly moved forward across the Arizona prairie. And after the storm passed, he had kept his word to the young girl by saddling his horse at first light and riding her back toward the lands where her people lived, guiding the horse carefully across snow-covered ground while the cold morning sun slowly melted the ice along the hills. And even though neither of them spoke much during the ride, there was a quiet understanding between them that the journey was important, because Nathan knew the child belonged with her family, and the girl seemed to trust that he would bring her safely there. By midday, the snow had begun to fade into patches of white across the grasslands, and when they reached the rocky hills beyond the prairie, Nathan noticed distant figures watching from the ridge. Apache riders who had clearly been searching for the missing child since the storm began, and within minutes several of them approached across the open land, their horses steady and alert while the riders studied the stranger who had brought the girl back to them. And Nathan simply lifted the girl down from his saddle before stepping back so she could run toward the group waiting for her. One of the riders spoke quietly to the child, asking if she was hurt, and she shook her head before turning once more toward Nathan with the kind of serious expression that children sometimes carry when they understand more than adults expect. And even though her voice was still soft from the cold, she managed to say thank you in careful English, a simple phrase that sounded small in the wide silence of the prairie. Nathan nodded in return and tipped his hat politely to the riders, because on the frontier respect often traveled farther than words. And then he turned his horse toward home without waiting for praise or reward, riding back across the open land as the afternoon sun slowly dried the last patches of snow from the grass. Time passed after that the way it often does on the frontier, quietly and without ceremony. Seasons rolling across the ranch one after another, while the years carried Nathan deeper into the life of a solitary rancher who spent most of his days repairing fences, tending horses, and watching the horizon for storms. And the story of the girl he had once helped slowly faded into the past, until even Nathan himself thought of it only occasionally during long winter evenings by the fire. The town nearby grew larger as new settlers arrived and businesses opened along the dusty road. But Nathan Cole remained mostly the same, a man known by some and forgotten by many, living on land that had belonged to him for decades yet somehow felt more distant from the changing world each year. Still, the ranch endured through droughts, hot summers, and cold winters, standing quietly against the wide desert sky, while Nathan worked the same fields and walked the same porch boards that had carried him through most of his life. And he never imagined that somewhere beyond the mountains a young Apache girl had grown into adulthood with a memory she had never allowed to fade. Because while many people believe that small acts of kindness disappeared with time, there are moments on the frontier that travel much farther than the wind across the prairie. The years that followed moved slowly across the ranch, but the world around Nathan Cole did not remain the same. Because as new settlers arrived in the Arizona territory, the quiet frontier began to change in ways that older ranchers like Nathan could feel long before anyone else spoke about it. One warm spring morning, a wagon rolled down the dusty road toward his property, carrying two well-dressed men who looked far more comfortable in town offices than on open prairie. And when they stepped down from the wagon, they studied the land carefully, as if measuring something invisible across the wide grass fields, glancing toward the hills and then toward the long wooden fence that marked the edges of Nathan's ranch. Nathan watched them from his porch while leaning against the railing, his hat pulled low against the sun as the men approached with polite smiles that did not quite hide their intentions. And one of them unfolded a large paper map across the hood of the wagon before, explaining that new development plans were being prepared for the region, plans that included roads, cattle routes, and parcels of land that companies in the eastern states were now interested in purchasing. The man pointed to a section of the map and spoke about opportunity and progress, while describing how the area could soon become far more valuable than it had been in the past. But Nathan could already see where the conversation was leading because the map lines ran directly across the land his ranch had occupied for nearly 3 decades. When the man finally asked whether Nathan might consider selling the property and relocating closer to town, Nathan simply shook his head slowly and said that the land had been his home longer than most people in the county had lived there, and that he was not interested in leaving it behind just because someone else believed it might be worth more money. The men remained polite, yet their smiles faded slightly as they folded the map again and returned it to the wagon, explaining that surveys would still be conducted across the surrounding land in the coming weeks, whether Nathan participated or not. And by the following afternoon, wooden survey stakes had already begun appearing across distant fields like small markers planted in the soil by strangers who believed the future belonged to them. Nathan walked along his fence line that evening studying the new stakes pushed into the earth several hundred yards away, the warm wind moving across the prairie while the sun lowered slowly behind the mountains. And although he had faced droughts and harsh winters during his years on the frontier, he understood that changes like these were often harder to resist than storms, because they arrived quietly and carried the weight of distant decisions made in offices far beyond the desert. The town soon began discussing the surveys as well, with some people believing the new development might bring jobs and growth, while others wondered what would happen to the smaller ranches scattered across the land. And through it all, Nathan continued his daily routine as he always had, repairing fences, checking water troughs, and riding the pasture each morning before the heat grew too strong. But even as he worked the land, he noticed something unusual beginning to appear on the horizon during certain evenings. faint trails of dust rising far beyond the hills where the prairie stretched toward Apache territory, dust that seemed too steady to belong to wandering cattle or passing traders. And although Nathan could not yet see the riders hidden within that distant haze, the land itself seemed to be quietly preparing for the moment when the past would ride back across the prairie toward the ranch once again. The quiet tension that had begun creeping across the prairie did not disappear in the days that followed, and Nathan Cole could feel it in the way the land seemed to hold its breath each morning when the sun rose over the dry Arizona hills. Because the survey stakes planted by the land agents were no longer the only strange signs appearing across the horizon. Several mornings in a row, Nathan noticed long ribbons of dust far beyond the distant ridge where the desert rolled toward Apache territory, and at first he assumed they were traders or cattle drivers moving along the old trails that crossed the region. But the dust returned again and again at nearly the same hour each day, always too far away to see clearly, yet too steady to belong to wandering livestock. The town noticed it as well, and before long the conversations inside the general store began shifting from talk about new development plans to quiet speculation about the riders traveling somewhere beyond the hills. Because the frontier had always taught people that dust on the horizon meant movement, and movement often meant change. One afternoon, Nathan rode into town to collect supplies and found a small crowd standing outside the general store watching the distant prairie where the dust rose again under the bright sunlight. And although no one could see the riders clearly yet, the shape of the moving cloud stretched long enough across the horizon that everyone knew it was not a small group. One man guessed it might be a large trading caravan heading north, while another suggested it could be cattle being driven across the territory. But Nathan said nothing as he stood beside his horse and studied the distant haze, because something about the slow and steady pattern of the movement reminded him of organized riders rather than wandering travelers. By the time he returned to the ranch that evening, the prairie had grown quiet again, the dust gone as if the riders had vanished into the hills. Yet the feeling that something was building out there did not leave him. The following morning, the air carried a dry warmth across the land as Nathan repaired a section of fence along the pasture, hammer striking wood while meadowlarks called from the grass. And just as he set the final nail, he noticed the same distant dust rising again along the far ridge, this time wider than before and moving with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. He leaned on the fence post and watched it for several minutes, the wind brushing through the tall grass while the dust slowly spread along the horizon like a low drifting cloud. And even though the riders were still too far away to count, he could already tell that there were many of them traveling together. Back in town, the rumors began growing faster with every passing day. Some people worrying that a large Apache group might be moving through the territory, while others insisted it was only a seasonal migration of riders traveling between distant settlements. Yet no one could explain why the dust always appeared in the same direction, or why it seemed to move closer to Nathan Cole's ranch each time it returned. Late one afternoon, as the sun dipped toward the mountains, Nathan stood once again on his porch watching the open prairie stretch out before him. And when the distant dust rose again, he noticed something different for the first time. Because the cloud was no longer drifting sideways across the horizon, but slowly moving straight toward his land. And although the riders were still hidden beyond the hills, Nathan felt the quiet certainty that whatever journey had begun somewhere far beyond the prairie was now finally riding in his direction. By the next morning, the distant dust was no longer something people could dismiss as imagination, because when the sun climbed over the desert hills, the horizon beyond Nathan Cole's ranch carried a long moving cloud that stretched farther across the prairie than anyone in the town had ever seen before, and word spread quickly along the dirt road that something large was approaching from the direction of Apache territory. Nathan noticed it first while standing beside the corral gate with a bucket of grain in his hand, his horses lifting their heads as the faint vibration of many hooves carried across the dry land. a low rhythmic sound that traveled through the ground before it reached the ears. And although the riders were still miles away, the movement across the horizon was steady and unmistakable. By late morning, the dust had grown taller and darker against the sky, and several townspeople rode out along the road that passed Nathan's ranch so they could watch from a safer distance, their wagons and horses forming a loose line beside the fence while everyone studied the approaching cloud with the uneasy curiosity that frontier life often produced when something unusual appeared. Nathan stepped onto the porch and rested his hands on the railing while the wind carried the warm smell of dry grass across the pasture, his eyes fixed on the slowly growing shapes beyond the ridge. Because by now he could clearly see the outlines of riders moving together across the open land, not scattered like travelers but aligned in long rows that moved with quiet discipline across the prairie. Someone near the road muttered that there must be at least 100 riders out there, while another voice guessed there might be even more hidden behind the first lines. And as the distance slowly closed, the shapes of horses and riders became clearer under the bright afternoon sunlight. The riders did not rush or scatter as they approached, but moved with a calm, steady pace that seemed almost ceremonial, their formation spreading across the horizon like a living wall that rolled closer with every passing minute. Nathan felt the old boards of the porch beneath his boots as he stepped down onto the yard and walked slowly toward the ranch gate. Because although the town behind him had grown quiet with uncertainty, he sensed that whatever was coming across the prairie was not arriving in anger, but in purpose. By the time the first line of riders reached the far edge of his pasture, the dust had begun drifting away in the breeze, revealing dozens of horses moving shoulder to shoulder beneath the open sky. Their riders dressed in the traditional clothing of the Apache people, feathers and leather catching the sunlight, while the long line behind them continued stretching farther back across the prairie than Nathan could count. The townspeople watching from the road had fallen completely silent now, their earlier whispers replaced by the kind of careful attention people give when history seems to be unfolding in front of them. And as the riders finally slowed near the wooden gate at the entrance of Nathan's ranch, the entire prairie seemed to pause in the quiet moment before the truth of their arrival would finally be revealed. The prairie held its breath as the riders finally came to a halt just beyond the wooden gate of Nathan Cole's ranch, their horses shifting quietly under the wide desert sky, while the last trails of dust drifted away in the warm afternoon wind. And for several long seconds no one spoke, because the sight before the townspeople watching from the road was unlike anything they had ever witnessed on that quiet stretch of frontier land. Nathan walked forward slowly across the dry grass until he stood a few steps from the gate, his posture calm and steady even though the line of riders stretched far behind their leader like a living wall across the prairie. And as the wind moved through the tall grass, the only sound left was the quiet breathing of the horses and the distant creak of leather saddles settling after the long ride. The rider at the front studied Nathan carefully for a moment before swinging one leg over the saddle and stepping down onto the ground, moving with the confidence of someone who had traveled many miles to reach this place. And when the figure pushed back the edge of a long riding cloak, the sunlight revealed a face Nathan had not seen in many years, yet somehow recognized immediately. The child he had once lifted onto his horse during a winter storm was no longer a small girl lost in the snow, but a grown woman whose calm expression carried both strength and memory, her dark hair moving gently in the prairie wind as she stepped closer to the gate. The riders behind her remained silent and respectful, watching the moment unfold without urgency, while the townspeople in the distance leaned forward on their wagon rails trying to understand what was happening. Nathan felt the years between that stormy night and this warm afternoon pass through his thoughts like a long road stretching across the land. And although time had changed the young girl into a leader among her people, The steady determination in her eyes was something he remembered clearly. The woman stopped a few feet from the gate and looked at Nathan with quiet certainty before speaking again, her voice strong enough to carry across the yard, while still holding the calm respect that had been present in her words years earlier when she thanked him beside the snowy hills. And she said that the journey across the prairie had taken many days because the riders who followed her wished to come with her when the time finally arrived to repay a promise made long ago. Nathan glanced past her toward the long line of Apache riders stretching across the prairie behind her, realizing now that the gathering he had watched forming beyond the horizon was not a random movement across the land, but a deliberate return, a moment that had been waiting patiently through the passing years until the right day arrived. The woman then gestured gently toward the distant survey stakes standing in Nathan's pasture and explained that word of the trouble surrounding the ranch had reached Apache territory weeks earlier through traders and travelers. And when she heard the news, she remembered the man who had once carried a lost child safely through a blizzard when no one else had been there to help. As the wind moved softly across the prairie, she finished her words by telling Nathan that among her people a kindness is never forgotten. And when the riders behind her shifted their horses slightly under the fading afternoon sun, the entire prairie seemed to understand that the arrival of hundreds of riders at a lonely ranch was not the beginning of a conflict, but the return of a promise that had waited patiently across the years. The prairie remained quiet after the woman finished speaking, but the meaning of her words moved across the ranch yard like a slow wind through tall grass. And Nathan Cole stood beside the wooden gate, feeling the weight of many years settle gently into the present moment, because what she had said was simple, yet carried the kind of truth that only time can prove. He looked past her once again toward the riders who had traveled across the desert to stand behind their leader, men and women seated calmly on horseback beneath the wide Arizona sky, their horses steady and patient, as if they understood the purpose of their journey had already been fulfilled the moment they arrived. The townspeople watching from the road could now see clearly that the riders had not come to threaten anyone, and the tension that had once filled the air slowly faded into something closer to awe. Because few people on the frontier had ever witnessed a gathering like this where hundreds of riders appeared not out of conflict but out of respect, the woman stepped a little closer to the gate and explained that when she returned to her people as a child, she had told them about the rancher who carried her safely through a blizzard. And although many winters had passed since that night, the story had never disappeared from the memory of her family or her tribe. Because among the Apache, a life saved is not a moment that fades with time, but a bond that continues across generations. Nathan listened quietly, his hat still in his hand as the warm breeze crossed the prairie. And while he had never expected anything in return for helping a lost child, he could see now that the kindness of one cold night had traveled much farther than he had ever imagined. The woman then turned slightly and gestured toward the distant survey stakes that had been planted across the pasture weeks earlier, the small wooden markers that had caused so much worry in the town. And she explained that when traders passed through Apache territory, they had spoken about the rancher whose land might soon be taken by outsiders who did not understand the history of the place. And when she heard those stories, she knew the moment had come to return the kindness that had once protected her during the worst storm of her childhood. Behind her, the riders began to move slowly across the prairie in small groups, guiding their horses along the edges of the pasture while studying the land carefully as if mapping the boundaries of the ranch with their eyes alone. And the townspeople could only watch as the quiet movement of so many riders transformed the empty fields into a living presence that no survey map could easily ignore. Nathan followed their movement across the land and understood what was happening even before the woman spoke again. Because the riders were not there simply to visit, but to stand as witnesses that the ranch and the man who lived there were not alone in the world. And when the woman looked back at Nathan, she told him that promises on the frontier are not written on paper, but carried in memory. and the riders who had come across the desert that day had arrived to make certain that the promise made on a cold winter night would never be forgotten. The riders continued moving slowly across the pasture as the warm Arizona sun lowered toward the distant hills, their horses stepping calmly through the tall grass, while the quiet presence of so many people on the land transformed the ranch from a lonely place into something that felt suddenly protected by memory and respect. Nathan Cole stood beside the gate watching them with the thoughtful stillness of a man who had lived long enough to understand that some moments arrive only once in a lifetime. And although he had faced storms, droughts, and the quiet hardships of frontier life, he had never expected to see the day when hundreds of riders would gather at his ranch not because of fear or conflict, but because of a kindness he had once offered without expecting anything in return. The Apache woman who had once been the lost child stepped closer to the pasture fence and looked across the land as if she could still see the small footprints in the snow that had once marked the path of a frightened girl during a winter storm many years before. And when she spoke again, her voice carried calmly across the field so that the townspeople watching from the road could hear the words clearly. She said that the riders who had come across the desert that day were not there to claim the land or to challenge anyone, but to stand as witnesses that the ranch and the man who lived there had friends far beyond the borders of the town. Because among her people a promise made during hardship is remembered long after the storm has passed. The riders continued their quiet movement along the pasture lines, their horses tracing the edges of the land where the survey stakes had been placed earlier that season. And as they moved, the simple message became impossible for anyone watching to ignore, because the presence of so many riders made it clear that the ranch was no longer a forgotten place on the frontier, but a home connected to a story that had traveled across years and across cultures. The townspeople slowly began speaking among themselves again as the sun lowered toward the horizon, their voices no longer filled with worry, but with something closer to amazement as they realized that what they were witnessing was not a confrontation, but a rare moment when the past had returned in a powerful and unexpected way. Nathan looked across the prairie once more, the golden light of evening stretching across the grass while the riders gathered calmly near the edge of the field, and he finally placed his hat back on his head with the quiet understanding that the land he had protected for so many years would not be taken away as easily as strangers once believed. The woman who had returned after all those winters gave him a final respectful nod before mounting her horse again. And as the long line of riders slowly turned toward the open prairie, the fading sunlight illuminated the scene in a way that felt almost timeless, leaving the ranch standing peacefully beneath the wide sky while the echoes of hooves carried across the land, reminding everyone who had witnessed that day that a single act of